Afternoon, everyone. Might as well get started. I'm Pete Goldsmith, professor here in the department, and I really want to thank you all for coming to today's seminar. This is a little bit different in that we are webcasting the seminar to a global audience, which is kind of fun. So I wanted to welcome those outside the U.S. Attending the seminar webinar. Today's seminar is sponsored by the Department of Ag and Consumer Economics here at the U of I, the Food and Agribusiness Program here at the U of I, and USAID's Soybean Innovation Lab. Friday noon seminars are a regular event here in the department. And today's speaker and topic have special interest, though, to really the virtual soybean research community around the world. So there's some people who really wanted to chime in and see and listen to this webinar. So there's broad interest. So we decided to expand the seminar through the webcast. I hope you enjoy today's 50-minute seminar. Let me introduce the speaker. I've gotten to know Dr. Richards and his team over the last couple of years. I've made two very enjoyable trips to Brown to speak and collaborate with his team. And so I'm really pleased that Peter accepted my reciprocal invitation to visit here. And I'll go down there next month for a third visit and continue the collaboration, which is great. Dr. Richards has a PhD in geography from Michigan State University and an MS in agricultural economics, also from MSU. Peter and I not only share a wonderful first name, but Peter has a BA in political science, as I do, and he was a Peace Corps volunteer in Latin America, and I as well did the same thing. But Peter specialized in beekeeping, while I specialized in large animal husbandry, artificial insemination, and cattle management. So there, I got him one up there. But Peter currently is the National Science Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow in Interdisciplinary Research. He works within the Institute for the Study of the Environment and Society at Brown University. And so I'm so pleased to have Peter here. Let's welcome Richards.
Thank you. Peter, I have to say that we did change our name. We are no longer the Institute for the Study of Environment and Society. We were formerly known as ISIS, but we decided to switch around. So now, since December, we've been known as the Institute at Brown for Environment and Society. So thank you very much for the invitation. I know I've spoken to a number of you already, but for me, it was really exciting to come out here. I've worked in Mato Grosso or in Brazil now for 8 years, and I've always heard about Illinois. And sometimes I would hear about Peter Goldsmith. And there's ever such thing as a rock star professor in the soybean sector in Brazil. I mean, it would be here with Peter. So for me, it was really important to finally reach out and finally get to actually come in and see what it's like here. And I have to say, when I was coming out here and putting together the slides, I went up and went and checked out the land use for Champaign-Urbana. And this is actually from that Cropscape layer, which is really amazing based on some Landsat data, but it's all soybeans and corn. And I was shocked. And then I got here, and it's even flatter than Mato Grosso, which I didn't realize could actually be possible. But this is actually some of the data that we have from our own group at Brown based on some MODIS satellite data. This is actually 2011. I guess I have the wrong date up there. But this is all soybeans and corn, or I should say, in this case, your orange is soy corn, yellow is corn, green is forest or pasture, white is cotton. But it struck me how similar actually the landscapes really are. There's not much else going on there. There's no barley or alfalfa or anything. But one other thing to realize, I want to give you a bit more background than I normally would here. But so one other difference between these two landscapes is there is a lot more forest in Mato Grosso relatively. And just to make clear, I think this has come up today, but there are some pretty strong environmental laws in Brazil, and actually most of that forest that you see is protected one way or another. But other than that, it looks a lot like here looks a lot like Mato Grosso. One other kind of difference I wanted to highlight, though, properties, as I think many of you know, are much, much larger. These are actually some property lines from an area in northern Mato Grosso. If you can superimpose them over, it's not me shaking, is it? Okay. I'll look this way. So I don't get dizzy. So some of the properties are as much as 1,000 hectares, 8,700 hectares, and just to put that into perspective, I mean, that's roughly the size of the entire urban area of Champaign-Urbana. So it's a lot of agriculture on some very large sizes, and also just to give you an idea, that one farm here, about 4,000 has about 4,000 hectares of soybean production. So that's a lot of money generated every year. I think I've also mentioned, and this is kind of important for later on, in 2008, a good year for agriculture might have generated about $500 per hectare. When you have 4,000 hectares of production, it's a lot of money in surplus profit being generated from year to year, and that's key for later. All right. One other final difference I wanted to touch on here in Mato Grosso is that the other thing to keep in mind is that this has changed a lot over a very short period of time. This is 2001, mostly corn, pasture, and forest. By 2011, two things have happened. You see a lot more intensification. You see more double cropping now, where you saw single cropping before. And you also see that you've basically filled in almost the maximum, at least in some of these areas, what you can with agriculture. So again, any forest that's left over is probably there largely due to environmental protections. All right. This is just a small area of Mato Grosso, but it's certainly, the past 10 years, has not been confined to just that one area. It's actually grown quite a bit. And this process, more broadly across Brazil, has been pretty phenomenal. This is just soybean areas in Brazil since 1990 have more than doubled. And I like to put that in perspective by saying that from about 2000 to 2005, you converted 100,000 square kilometers of agriculture, or I should say 100,000 square kilometers to soybean production. That's roughly taking an area the size of Kentucky and plowing it and turning it into a soybean field in 5 years. All right, that's just a massive agricultural expansion, and a lot of that was probably due to, of course, changes in returns. During the early 2000s, Peter and I have discussed this a few times now, but I would argue that the shock in returns is largely due to the devaluation of the real. You have some very favorable conditions for agriculture, and you have this massive agricultural expansion. Another thing I want to make fairly clear here, I've gotten this before. I've given this presentation sometimes, and people say, well, what are they doing with all the soybeans? And they really just, you don't eat that many soybeans. No. All this, Dilma and the Brazilian government is not simply consuming 10% of the world's soybean supply. It's actually, a lot of it's going abroad, all right? And this is a great graph put together by, the font changed. It's actually Stephanie Spera. It's not just by Stephanie, the image here. This was put together by a colleague of mine showing where the exports from Mato Grosso have actually gone over the past 10 years. Keep in mind that in 2001, most of it was going to Western Europe and a little bit over to East Asia. All right. In general, I mean, we don't eat soybeans. I didn't realize until last night that you can't really eat soybeans raw. I learned that last night. You generally, I've never tried, but you know, it takes about, I think it's about 2 pounds of soy to produce a pound of chicken, about 4 to produce a pound of pork, if I recall correctly. People in urban areas and wealthier countries tend to eat more pork, more chicken, more beef. To produce that, you need to produce more soybeans. So what's happened over the past decade is that you've seen people in new areas become quite wealthy, becoming increasingly urbanized, and that's basically where Mato Grosso soybeans are going today. So what you'll notice is that that trickle that was going to East Asia in 2001 has become an absolute river of soybeans. It's I think, and Peter, maybe you can correct me on this, but I think it's like 80% of Mato Grosso soybean harvest is exported directly, and I would wager that a large percentage of the remainder is probably either turned into pork and poultry, and then if not exported, sent to Sao Paulo or elsewhere in the country. All right, so you had a major change. Whenever you generate that much new agriculture, you can probably imagine you're going to generate a lot of value as well. So this is just a change in export value is in red. I mean, it's grown by almost 2,000% since 1995. That's a ton of cash that suddenly is being generated through foreign exchange tied to soybean production. Again, you can tie that also, unlike the other major staple crops, soybean production, corn production have grown dramatically largely on the demand for meat and processed food in urban areas. And one other thing that I want to kind of touch on here is that, I mean, say Brazil has taken advantage of this foreign exchange over the past 10 years. I mean, you've seen about 30 million people in Brazil come out of poverty between the last two censuses. So from 2000 to 2010, 15% of Brazil's population left poverty. It's pretty impressive as far as economic growth. A lot of that economic growth you can tie to I'd say cash generated or value generated through agriculture or through natural resource exports. And some of that value has actually been transferred back into funding these poverty reduction programs. I know conditional cash transfers have gotten a lot of attention in Brazil over the past 10 years. You could easily make the argument that some of the, let's say, redistribution policies favored by the PT and Dilma today are very much funded by the agricultural sector, which creates an interesting paradox. All right. So my research at Brown focuses on really a few areas, all right? What I'm not going to talk about today is this first part, how can we use growth to predict future expansion? How can we use the example of Mato Grosso's agricultural frontier to better understand where we can plant and how soybean agriculture expands into new regions? That's been a major focus of mine, but I'm not going to touch on that today. I do briefly want to touch on this first part here, namely the extent to which soybean agriculture is reshaping the physical landscapes of Brazil. It's had arguably a dramatic impact on on forest cover, especially in the Amazon. And then the focus of this research will later be how agriculture is actually leading indirectly to economic growth in urban areas. So on deforestation in Brazil, I mean, since 2000, you've had about 200,000 square kilometers of forest deforested. It's a huge amount. In Brazil alone, probably about 50,000 square kilometers of forest were actually removed. That's Amazon forest. If you would ask Greenpeace what's driving deforestation in the Amazon, they would have told you 10 years ago it was the soybean sector. The reality is probably, well, it is a lot more complicated. And I can expand on that at the end if someone's really interested in how soybean production is driving deforestation. But it's not necessarily farmers clearing the forest and planting new crops, all right? But what I can also say is that especially pre-2006, there was a fairly strong correlation between deforestation and cropland expansion. Since 2006, some new policies have put into place and have really, you know, I'm still come to terms with this idea, but have decoupled soybean production from deforestation. I think increasingly the evidence suggests that the Brazilian agricultural sector has been able to expand over the past 10 years now without dramatically reducing forest cover in the Amazon. All right. With that caveat said, and I'd be happy to come back to that at the end, I want to turn our attention and actually focus on a very different factor, namely the extent to which soybean production is actually leading indirectly to economic growth. And this question really became important to me because I would often speak with other social scientists who have been working in Brazil, and there's a discourse that was pervasive that said that you won't have local development through agriculture, that cash generated through agriculture is being sent to Sao Paulo, it's not leading to economic growth in Mato Grosso or elsewhere. And it was definitely very different from what I had seen on the field. And looking more into it, there certainly was a long-standing literature that said that actually agricultural production tends to not, you don't develop through agriculture. Which is a quote here I have from Jeffrey Sachs, obviously very well known. Almost without exception, the resource-abundant countries have stagnated in economic growth since the early 1970s, inspiring the term curse of natural resources. Empirical studies have shown that this curse is a reasonably solid fact. I've learned never say that a curse is such a thing as a reasonably established fact when it comes to social science research, because I think that the past 10 years have shown that Jeffrey Sachs was actually quite wrong in this assessment. And I will add also, he does define natural resources as, or agriculture as natural resources. So he includes that in his discussion of natural resources. So with that said, I wanted to that was very, as I said, it was very different from my own impressions of having worked in the area. You see this rapid development in areas of agricultural production, and it also, my anecdotal experiences were certainly supported by some recent statistical evidence. So we're finding that soybean production tends to be correlated with higher HDI. So HDI is a composite of life expectancy, education, and median income. You find that those indicators tend to be higher where you're actually producing soybean product, where you are farming soybeans across northern and central Brazil. You're seeing that soybean production is tied to increased income, reduced poverty, and correlated with higher inequality, obviously a potential negative outcome. Some work by people at Brown suggested that you're seeing a correlation between higher school quality in soybean production. And also, in some other work that I have that's forthcoming, we're seeing that there's more in-migration where you have more soybean production. I would also say you have more urban in-migration. All right. Now, one of the questions, though, is, I mean, how is soybean? Yes, Craig.
So, just, I mean, this is great. The soybean sector is driving all this, but what's the counterfactual? Counterfactual, no, nothing, or counterfactual?
The counterfactual, and by the way, when I say soybean production, I mean it can be soy corn, it can be soy cotton. I say soybean production because it's what really drives the whole agricultural sector, right? The other crops are really complementary crops. Cotton might be a little bit different, but yeah, it's generally you either have large-scale agriculture, or you have pasture and ranching, or you have forest, or you have some smallholder agricultural production. Okay, and some of the smallholder stuff can be either farming or it can be dairy production. That's a new trend. So really the counterfactual would be, so you have the areas that have grown fast with soybean production, and then you have the counterfactual, which is, let's say, areas that have been permanently dominated by the cattle sector, or cattle towns or timber towns, or possibly smallholder districts that have kind of formed, and these urban areas that have formed out of agricultural colonization, public land reform settlements.
So, I mean, it sounds like the counterfactual you could also phrase this as how does large-scale agriculture to small-scale agriculture?
You could. I'd have to think more about that to actually give details, but I think that's probably accurate. All right. Well, one of the questions that we were dealing with was how do you actually tie agriculture to economic spillovers outside of agriculture? I mean, obviously the economic growth in agriculture is occurring in rural areas. But our argument here is that you're actually having an urban growth that's tied to rural production. All right. So the city is a function of its rural surroundings and other things. Okay. So I would argue that really you see more urban growth tied to the size of the local agricultural sector. And I frame this through two ways. So first of all, you have what I will call these spillover effects. This idea that you have, say, an increased demand for services and for upstream and downstream linkages. I mean, a simple idea that says the more soybeans you have, the more need for inputs you have, which means you need more guys there to finance those crops, to distribute those inputs, to write up environmental plans, to do whatever, to service the tractors and so on, to sell the tractors. You have more demand for upstream employment, and downstream, as you have more soybeans being produced, you start to see more, I'd say you'll see more of demand for local processing facilities. You'll see potentially the expansion of things like chicken production and pig production. By the way, I was looking it up last night. I think Mato Grosso produces about 50,000 pigs per week. So, I mean, it's now a big business. Poultry is incredibly more, but I don't have a firm stat on that. But I mean, it's a huge business, especially over the past few years. The more you can expand these upstream and downstream linkages, the more value you're adding per year from agriculture, and the more urban growth you'll get. Okay, so one of the ideas is to have a larger agricultural sector, but then capture that value locally, and that will lead to urban growth. All right. The other way, and this is to me, it's the more interesting aspect of this, is that the agricultural sector is also creating is also providing investment capital. All right. So the farm I mentioned before, kind of at the outset, I said here's a farm that has about 4,000 hectares of agricultural soybean production. If you're generating on a good year, 2008, say about $500 per hectare, you're looking at about $2 million in surplus profits. The basic idea here is that a lot of that money is actually going back into the local economy. Okay, and this is specific to Mato Grosso in some ways because the farmers tend to live locally as opposed to, say, in Sao Paulo, which does occur, but I'm not saying that, I'd say it's not that as common as you might believe. And to make it clear, again, this is a lot of money. Okay, I've had people say, Mom, I had one of the reviewers for this paper, hopefully it wasn't in this room, said it's unlikely that mom and pop savings could drive economic growth. But again, by mom and pop savings, and Brazilian farmers like to frame themselves as family farmers. It's a little bit more complex than that, but it is a lot of money. And in many cases, it's not just buying a small, it's not just buying a new pickup truck. It's buying a new Range Rover and sending your daughter to Orlando. I mean, this is a lot of money coming through. And you can't consume it all. You're investing a lot of it. And I'll say in Brazil, I've rarely met farmers who have invested in IRAs or stock or hedge funds. It doesn't happen. If you're a farmer in a country that's been traditionally dominated by, let's say, inflation, and you have low faith, I guess, in your currency values going forward, you tend to want to invest in a more secure asset. Land is that asset, so a farmer's first choice for investment is generally land. What you see is that as you have more profits generated through agriculture, it gets put back into land, gets put back into what I'm learning is in Illinois is called rolling stock on silage facilities, increasing irrigation, but also into urban businesses and urban real estate. That's been a huge aspect, a huge part of local growth here going back the past 10 years, is that farming capital is not only going into farming, it's actually going into agricultural services, it's going into downstream linkages. The farmers themselves are financing these pig production facilities. That money is going into new schools, new private schools, new Range Rover dealerships. I keep bringing this up. To one of my research assistants this past fall was having a $60,000 wedding. Mine was $8,000. So I realized that it's a lot of money going through these areas, and a lot of it's coming from agriculture. And one more thing, I mean, as one last example, I always say, I mean, at Brown, the best students end up going into finance and working for J.P. Morgan and Mato Grosso. The students go and study agriculture and agribusiness. I think they even come here to do that, actually, come to think of it. So agriculture is a big business. And so what are the next... So to give it, so if I were to map this out spatially, the red dots are all of your cities in Mato Grosso. Okay, these are any municipal town centers. The blue area is your agricultural area. Now if you look at how things have actually changed over the past 10 years, this has changed in non-agricultural GDP. It tends to be higher, not coincidentally, I would argue, in agricultural areas. You're seeing change in non-agricultural formal sector employment. This is any employment in, say, services, construction, public administration, education, health. You've seen that you've had dramatic changes in non-agricultural employment in agricultural districts. You've had large changes in urban population. And actually, I don't have it up here, but you also have actually positive changes in rural population as well in these agricultural districts. And then this is just it's a fun measure, nighttime light emissions, but that has all sorts of issues that I'm happy to talk to you all about. But it does get one point across, which is that you tend to see more nighttime growth in nighttime lights in areas that are producing more agriculture. Nighttime lights, by the way, is a nice measure of urban economic activity. Okay, that captures formal and informal economies. All right, and that tends to be much higher, and the growth has been much higher in areas producing agriculture. Now, to specify this, I'm actually going to start out and say we want to estimate these indirect spillover effects. Now, we'll do that by I am framing, let's say, urban economic activity. It could be one of the several variables, which I'll talk about in a minute, as a function of the size of the local agricultural sector and a vector of controls. Okay, your location, let's say we test with lag-dependent variables as well, with and without. But you're saying that really urban economic activity in any given year is a function of the local controls for the urban economic activity and this regional agricultural effect. The idea being that agriculture kind of spills its capital into these urban areas and creates growth. All right? For profit effects, it's a little bit different. We're simply focusing on the idea that change in urban economic activity from one year to the next is a function of the size of the local agricultural sector interacting with prices. Okay, because remember, it's not just the size of agriculture that drives this investment, the production of investment capital. It's the ability of that agricultural sector to generate profits. All right. Now, how to actually estimate this last variable has been, I think, a long-standing question, much of spatial economics. How do you capture space? How do you measure sort of spatial spillover effects? And that's been, as a geographer, that's always been one of my technical interests. So I want to say that a lot of the work that's been done to date on, say, the impact of agriculture and urban growth has generally looked at, say, every urban area is a function of its administrative boundaries. Okay, like saying that Illinois is the growth of Chicago is a function of agriculture in the vicinity of Chicago. Essentially, is what kind of how you would frame that. To me, that was always inadequate, especially with all the new data sets that are coming out now that allow us to really have a pretty fine-scale understanding of where agriculture is. And so we decided to use a different way to actually measure these neighborhood agricultural effects. All right. So we actually do that by constructing essentially a matrix of travel times for the entire state. So this is actually, we can do that on our own by actually creating, by using Brazil's road network. So this is Mato Grosso's roads. This data actually comes from IBAMA, which is Mato Grosso's version of essentially the environmental police, but they carry weapons. And I found that they were the only ones who had really good data on where roads were in Mato Grosso. So this data shows you the distribution of roads. We can actually use that data and create, essentially, we can code each road segment according to its the road conditions. You see up on the top here I have different speeds, so we can essentially assign a speed to every segment of road in Mato Grosso and then calculate the travel time it would take to do the distance and then estimate the shortest cost path between really every city in Mato Grosso and every other location across the state. So for Cuiabá, the capital, you can map out travel times more or less that it would look something like this. You can notice, just to be really quick here, some areas are much more accessible than others. The road infrastructure in Mato Grosso is hugely important. Roads are still of highly varied quality. And certainly it's much easier to go, at least in northern Mato Grosso, north-south, than it is east and west. All right. So we actually went ahead and created what I'm going to call these 60-minute neighborhoods. Remember, we're trying at this point to come up with a measure of regional agricultural activity. So we have to find a way to define this regional agriculture and then measure its impact on local urban economic growth. So what I ended up doing is we actually selected a fairly arbitrary measure. We can test the sensitivity of this later, but we can say any areas that are located within 60 minutes of travel would be part of that city's neighborhood or that agricultural sector that pertains to that city. Okay, so for Cuiabá, we can actually create a 60-minute neighborhood that would look like this. The yellow area are all areas that you can reach within 60 minutes. And we can actually do things like estimate that or find the total area of agriculture within that neighborhood. For Cuiabá, this green dot here, it's not very much. Okay, but for other areas, it's actually quite large. So if we were to actually do that, come up with that, run through that process for every city, we can actually calculate, say, the total agriculture per the surroundings of every city in the state. Yes?
So we have these farms. These farms are quite large, as you know. Is this large-scale farmers just expanding and buying up a lot of this land, and when they bought up the land, did the people move in? So this is farmers buying up the land, and then the people who bought up the land then moving into these urban areas, or are the people from other states within Brazil coming in, or what exactly is happening?
Can I say all of the above? A bit of everything, okay? So there are people coming up, a lot from the south. A lot of people from the south. The agricultural sector has a longer tradition in southern Brazil. You would find people, especially in the early 2000s, would sell a smaller plot in the south and move up to areas of Mato Grosso, buy up an area, usually from an old timber company, an old timber concession, convert that, let's say clear the rest of the vegetation, and then convert that to agriculture. You saw that. That was very common. One other thing to realize here, and actually it was on my list to mention at the outset, but most of the farmers in Mato Grosso don't live on the farm. All right, they'll live in the urban areas, which is a small key here, actually. So you tend to live in urban areas because you have more access to services if you want to send your kid to school, or if your wife wants to be in an urban area, it's more secure. So you tend to put farmers live in urban areas, they don't live in the rural areas. As far as dislocation or displacement of other land uses or small farmers, it's complicated. From my own experiences, most of the soybean farms aren't taking place on sort of a aggregated smallholder districts, in part because the land tenure in those areas were not necessarily as clear as they could have been. That was one issue. Also, the transaction cost of trying to aggregate 100 hectare properties can be prohibitive, and it's a headache. Okay, so I think most of these large-holder farmers will actually try to avoid smallholder districts, and they'll actually buy areas, typically subdivide or buy up an old latifundia ranch, which there's still some legacy ranches in the area. Sometimes they get divided. Sometimes old timber concessions get divided. So it tends to be more of these big properties that get subdivided into smaller farms. In the past 5 years, I'd say that trajectory has changed a little bit in that you have more concentration in the hands of larger farmers. The more successful farmers are buying up more farms. Okay, that's in this. With all that said, I can come up with essentially the sum of agriculture. Return here to the slide. The sum of agriculture by city. This is a measure again of agriculture in each city's neighborhood. We can do that by year, so you see that you have some variation across each year. Now, our next step was actually to go ahead and really specify urban activity. Again, and this is a simple specification here, but a function of local controls and this neighborhood agricultural variable, which is really the variable of key interest. There's two dependent variables I want to touch on first, and that's this formal sector non-agricultural employment and non-agricultural GDP. Essentially, what we're estimating here are the spillover effects of agriculture going back to 2000. And a fixed effects model, where we come up with one coefficient here, we're estimating essentially about a spillover effect of roughly 2 jobs per square kilometer. Okay, it's significant, and that's about 180,000 reais and 2002 values per square kilometer. That's roughly about $200,000 today, okay, per square kilometer, or $2,000 per hectare. But it gets more interesting to me when I actually break down my panel into cross sections, slice it into 1-year intervals, and then re-estimate these equations for each year. All right, you'll start to see a certain trend over the past couple decades. 2002, we're estimating about 0.7 spillover effects from agriculture per square kilometer. It goes up to 1.21, and then continues up all the way to about 2.5 today. And this is even when controlling for natural agglomeration in that urban economy. Okay, and what I'm arguing has happened is that increasingly you're able to capture value in Mato Grosso. And this has been a process that's occurred over the past 10 years as you've increased processing capacity, as you've increased pig production, as you've drawn in more labor to support the agricultural sector. You're seeing that the agricultural sector is increasingly related to a larger number of spillover jobs, and I'll show you in a minute. Non-agricultural GDP. Okay. Now, where I think it gets more interesting is when you actually look at. Oh well. First off, this is on the left is non-agricultural GDP for all of Mato Grosso. We're estimating about 70% outside. This is excluding the capital region, but outside the capital region, about 70%, 65% of Mato Grosso's GDP is probably a spillover from the agricultural sector. It's huge, but having worked in that area for that long, it is the size of the agricultural sector in Mato Grosso is indeed that massive. We also estimate that about, again, 60% of employment is actually a spillover from the agricultural sector. Again, as massive as this sounds, having worked in the area, I should say it's certainly supported by my own anecdotal experiences, which I hate to do, but it's as massive as it is, you have to recognize the actual scale of the agricultural sector within the state. It's not exactly a coincidence, I guess, that the previous governor was also one of the major soybean figures in the state. Yes? Mm-hmm. I said. The only generally, I mean, well, generally the criticism I get is this idea that actually, how do you know that the manufacturing sector or local urban growth isn't driving this local changes in agriculture. That's generally the question I get. I mean, there is a way we can do that, and I can go into a bit more later, that we can actually instrument for local agricultural production. But I think the best way to explain it is the fact that given the proportion of soybeans that are ultimately exported, you have to realize that this is driven, the agricultural sector is driven primarily by global consumption of soybean production. I mean, that's really where your demand is coming from. It's not coming from the local urban areas. As far as like other policies that might be heterogeneous across and say disproportionately affect the urban growth in the soybean sectors, that's a good question that I haven't gotten before. I'll have to think about that. As I said, there are some things that we can do, but I haven't actually had that question before. So let me come back to it. Actually, I think though that the next slides will actually maybe support what I'm saying though, so you might not be convinced anyhow. So okay, the second set of specifications focuses on these profit effects. And again, this is really where, to me, a lot of this growth has really come from, this idea that agriculture is generating profits, which are actually reinvested back into urban areas. And really, this has been really important since 2006. Okay, so since 2006, environmental laws have been more enforced. You've seen that more capital that might have otherwise gone into agriculture back into the agricultural sector to open up new land has actually gone into urban areas. All right, but the basic idea here is that the more capital generated by agriculture, the larger the change in urban activity. Now, this requires realizing that, first of all, agricultural profits have varied throughout the year and throughout the past decade. And to answer your question a little bit, possibly, so 2003, 2000 to 2004 were some pretty tough years for Brazil. All right. Going back to the exchange rate issue, you had the collapse of the real. These were tough economic times for Brazil. What I'm going to show you here is that during those tough economic times, there were actually boom times for Mato Grosso. You'll see that in just a second. All right, so that I think does support my argument a little bit. So profits have varied a lot. What you would expect then is that when 2002 to 2004, when you generate a lot of capital, you're going to have strong rates of urban growth during those periods. Okay, so here's what we actually do. We slice our data into cross-sections and run our estimates over each year. We'll estimate that, say, in 2002, you generated about 0.2 new jobs per square kilometer of agriculture. That, as you can see, goes up through 2004, drops down, and then goes down, goes up again in 2008. This is essentially the trend that each coefficient, again, each plotted coefficient is our estimate of the total jobs created as spillover effects from agriculture. And what you'll notice is that when I plot that against agricultural returns, which were calculated by a totally different set of data, you'll notice that actually our estimates closely track the returns to agriculture. What this suggests is agriculture is driving that urban growth, but the caveat is it only does so when profits are high. Yes? The 2005, 2006, I guess. My argument, the appreciation of the real against the dollar had a major impact on agricultural returns. Maybe some of you, I think I'm probably in a room where other people could tell me even better what happened. Well, remember, this here is this is the growth in urban economic activity. So it's not necessarily spillovers, which you expect to be more stable. So in other words, you're saying that there's little or no growth during that 3-year period. Okay, it's not. And as far as land abandonment, the reality is also there was some abandonment in 2006, 2007 when profits. That's not me beeping, is it? There was some abandonment in 2006, 2007 when profits were low. All right, is that clear? Okay, we did the same thing for GDP. This is growth, and I believe that's thousands of GDP in urban GDP generated per year, which you'll notice again, you see again that same pattern of non-agricultural GDP responding to profits in the agricultural sector. Okay, so that's my case, essentially that yes, agriculture is creating both spillovers and driving urban economic growth over the past decade. And again, by agriculture, I'm really referring to Mato Grosso soybean sector. Yes? Mm-hmm. Why is it different? Why do you have that? These, yeah. I mean, it's me. Well, I'll say a farmer responds to the returns, not the price. Yeah. Well, actually, it's not always true. Yeah. Well, the cost as well. I mean, these are returns in reais. Okay.
But I think what you're finding is if you drill down to the prices that the farmers are being exposed to in reals, there's your risk.
Guess I'm not really following then. In this case, well, we'll have to talk later on then. Okay. I do want to, before I actually, well, I don't know if I get to talk to you later today, but maybe you can explain that a bit further. But I do want to boil these numbers down to give you some sort of takeaway numbers, and we'll say that this is new urban employment, new non-agricultural GDP, urban populations, and nighttime light emissions that we find can be tied to indirectly to the agricultural sector. And really, we're arguing that about 60% of new formal sector non-agricultural employment is actually tied to the agricultural sector. We're arguing that about 40% of non-agricultural GDP in urban areas largely is a function of the agricultural sector. About 60% of the new urban residents in Mato Grosso, outside the capital area, again, are spillovers from agriculture. Point is that the agricultural sector has had a dramatic impact on urban growth across Mato Grosso. All right. Some implications I want to touch on quickly. First of all, to go back to one of the original questions, can agriculture drive urban growth and development? Second, is the Mato Grosso case applicable elsewhere? Third, is the pathway sustainable? And fourth, was it worth it? This is often the question I get, especially given the environmental impacts. First of all, as far as broader scale economic development, I think the evidence here, and certainly I think the statistics that are increasingly coming out over the past 5-10 years have suggested that soybean agriculture can very much lead to broader scale economic growth. I'll make the argument, though, that that's only with the caveat that returns have to be high to actually generate that actual growth. The other thing here to realize is that this Mato Grosso case is actually, I think, very similar to what we've seen in other natural resource exporting nations over the past 10-15 years. So resources, let's say oil prices have been high, so you've seen rapid growth in urban populations and GDP in places like Qatar and Dubai. Venezuela has become increasingly urbanized over the past 15 years. But I think actually the oil sector provides a great parallel also, because just like the soybean sector, I mean, you're essentially dependent upon global prices and you have very little input on what those prices are actually going to be. All right. And the other parallel between urban growth elsewhere in the world is that you're seeing that in Mato Grosso, this urbanization and economic growth has not occurred through manufacturing or industrialization, which has been the long-standing story of what drives urban growth, but rather it's been driven by the creation and expansion of service and commercial sectors. I mean, you buy food in the grocery or in Mato Grosso, the food in your grocery store is probably coming from Minas Gerais or from Sao Paulo State. It's very little of it is coming from Mato Grosso, and every car that comes to Mato Grosso isn't produced in Mato Grosso. Even the used cars come from Sao Paulo State. Okay, so everything is brought up. All the manufactured goods, the tractors that are used locally, are all being built in Sao Paulo. You're seeing that actually in Mato Grosso, at least, the urbanization has largely and almost uniformly occurred through the growth in service and commercial sectors. Now, the one thing that does separate Mato Grosso a little bit from oil nations is that you've increasingly been able to capture that value locally. All right, and that's the more you can develop these upstream and downstream linkages, the more capital you're grabbing, and the more you can actually develop these spillover effects. The danger, as I mentioned, and here's the other great thing about oil, about the parallel to oil-producing countries, is that when returns fall, so there's growth. I mean, I think even North Dakota now is worried about their budget coming up in the next few years. When returns have fallen for oil, obviously it's potentially going to devastate economies in different corners of the world. In Brazil right now, future growth will very much depend on agricultural returns. And the next thing here is the cost. All right, so I've often had people give me a cost-benefit and want a cost-benefit analysis. So I've said agriculture drives $13.5 billion of non-agricultural GDP growth indirectly, and you can add on to that $6.5 billion in direct GDP generated by agriculture. That's $20 billion in total. And so, I mean, how do you balance, how does that weigh against the forest that was lost in Mato Grosso? I have a, yeah, so I said before about 50,000 square kilometers were lost in Mato Grosso. I think, it's the next slide perhaps, yes, okay. So since 1900, some other researchers at Brown, so we've lost about 300,000 square kilometers of forest in Mato Grosso, all right? Now, in total, they estimated that 300,000 square kilometers was the equivalent of about 4.8 billion tons of carbon. And I hate measuring the value of a forest by carbon, but for the moment, let me do that and say that, let's say you lost about 300,000 kilometers of forest, worth about 4.8 billion tons of carbon. Last time I checked, I think in the EU markets, a ton of carbon is worth about $8. And in California right now, it's about 12, so it's not very high. Let's call it 10. Multiply 10 by 4.8 billion. You're looking at the total value of CO2 equivalent released in Mato Grosso for this is the entire state again. This isn't just soybean areas, it's all areas. It's worth about $48 billion. And I can make the argument that total value added by agriculture in 1 year, in 2010, is about $20 billion. I'm not saying to ever go and cut down all the forest. I'm simply saying that if your only measure of forest value is carbon, it's probably a pretty easy choice from a policy point of view, which way to go. So I want to close with that. Thank you very much. I do want to. There's 3 co-authors I really need to acknowledge. Heitor is a PhD student at Brown Economics. Leah Van Wey, who's a sociologist, and Steph Sparrow, who did a lot of the remote sensing work. And thank you all very much. So appreciate it.
So going back to your last slide when you talk about the environmental costs, so you used carbon emissions as an environmental indicator.
Yeah.
And so my question is, have you considered to use other environmental indicators as well as biodiversity, for instance, which is very important in that. And another question is, the status of compliance with the forest code. You mentioned environmental laws that have become more common.
Yeah.
So I was curious about status of compliance and the soybean sector.
You know, that's a funny. Well, the first question as far as biodiversity, I haven't, and that's so hard to quantify. You know, I would rather actually just say, here's the area of forest that's lost, and say that that's terrible, and say recognize what happened. I mean, this was a forest before. You have to, when you go down there, you have to realize it's kind of what actually happened to create the agricultural land. I mean, if the value of a forest is far, far more than carbon, I would never say go to forest for agriculture unless you're doing it, hopefully, while recognizing the potential costs. At the same time, I would say maximize the trade-offs if you are going to change that land cover. All right, but I haven't actually, I wouldn't even know, no one knows how to value a forest, actually. It's been an ongoing issue, all right? And there's all different ways, none of which I find are adequate. I mean, from a personal philosophy, I find the value more intrinsic. So it's, I'm only using carbon and saying, then saying, realize what you are doing.
I have a public saying very simplistic analysis, like, multiplying the cost of carbon emission by...
I say that with the full caveat that it's not a full value of a forest by any means. I would almost say, if you're only going to value a forest by carbon, this is how things shake out. Okay. As far as the other question about compliance, this is a major issue now. These environmental laws have been increasingly enforced since 2006. There's all sorts of evidence that suggests that the number of enforcement or number of violations enforced has gone up dramatically. It has been a real priority, especially in Mato Grosso. I've mentioned to you this morning, elsewhere in the Amazon, in Pará State, which is this area up here, its enforcement's murkier. It's part of the reason why they're trying to regulate land ownership, so that then they can actually go and enforce it. They know who owns it. So that's increasingly happening. I've always said soybean producers have more skin in the game, and therefore they're less likely to break the law. Now, that said, I sometimes find my assumption to be quite wrong. Actually, there was a major bust this past November, I think. So I just got back from Brazil. The survey team had to collect data from a few of these landowners that we had identified, and sure enough, a couple of them were in jail. And it was a big sting about land grabbing and illegal deforestation tied directly to some high-ranking people in the agricultural sector in Mato Grosso. Okay, so in general, I'd say they are. I think they're more compliant because, again, they need those environmental permits to get their financing and to also just avoid being in jail. If you're going to invest more in land if you're planting soybeans than you would if you're ranching. But realize that it's still a bit of the Wild West, and those roots aren't quite gone yet. So you still see some things going on. Yes. All right.
We did have a question that came in.
Great.
About the applications to African development. What you've learned or what might we learn about development in other parts of the world, other tropical parts of the world?
Yeah. Well, I would say two things. First of all, that soybean agriculture can generate, again, let's go back, the larger point here is that it can generate broader economic growth outside the agricultural sector, but only if the profits are high enough. So it's relevant to assume if you were able to generate an agricultural sector, and that's a soybean sector in parts of Africa, I mean, the potential to capture that value is going to depend on the potential for the farmers to gain those returns. A simplistic answer. But I will also say in Mato Grosso, it's been key that they've been able to reinvest those profits back into the local economy, into upstream and downstream linkages, into providing those services locally, and to producing that poultry locally. So once you get the agricultural sector, I think it's incredibly important to make sure that those profits are sent back into the peripheral sectors to the agricultural economy. The other key about Mato Grosso, and I mentioned this a couple times today, is that farmers tend to live locally. So if you're only outsourcing if your farms are owned by foreign owners only, you're going to see that that capital is going to go back to wherever it is that those owners tend to reside, or it's going to go elsewhere. And so by having at least a strong share of those farmers living locally, you're going to see that you are going to ensure that more of that capital, again, stays local, invested locally. Yes. Mostly soy. Most of it goes as soy oil, or soy meal, and that's largely due to the way they tax the exports. So primary goods are not taxed fully. Maybe someone can correct me on that. So yeah, is that right? So most of it's either raw or right is raw. So
Processed in the state or exported raw.
okay, yep.
Exactly.
So most of it's going to pig feed and poultry feeds. Yes. Mm-hmm. You know, the infrastructure in Mato Grosso is really crazy. I mean, they've grown a lot. During the last administration, they invested a ton in roads and whatnot. That they created these private consortiums to essentially create a cooperative that would maintain a road into some of these new areas. It was really it's well done. Today, some of the federal highways are actually being essentially leased to private companies to maintain them. Which I think there's been some question about how effective that would be. From my own experiences, actually, it seems like they're actually better maintained, so shockingly. And you actually have like emergency vehicles on the road these days, so you do see some major improvements. One funny story is that, and one more thing is that every sack of soybeans sold in Brazil, a small portion goes toward an infrastructure pool, a pool of capital. But as I was told, Brazil had the World Cup, and they had the World Cup in Cuiabá, and I was told that all that money went towards World Cup improvements over the past 4 or 5 years. So Cuiabá is all torn up, has been all torn up in the past 4 years. They put in a rail that has not been, has no cars yet. But some would say that actually the roads have been lacking over the past 4 or 5 years. We'll see how that goes forward. That's a good question. But there are actually there is a public fund that's supported by agriculture that in theory will go back into maintaining roads. And, I will say one last thing is that I find these farmers in Mato Grosso tend to always, they like to dream big. And I mean, they built towns where there was nothing 30, 40 years ago, and now, I mean, there's serious discussions over whether or not they can develop a waterway, which would go kind of up to this on the Teles Pires River, and go up by Santarém. We'll see if that happens. I always say I don't think it will, but then somehow it seems like they make a big step forward. There's been talk about a railway going north. At the same time, they've been saying they're going to pave this road that goes up to the Amazon River, where there's a port, and that's still not paved. So they've been saying that for 15 years. So we'll see. The ideas are there. The potential environmental consequences of developing a waterway out of the Teles Pires might be dramatic. And even then, maintaining that, like if you were to, the Mississippi isn't just about the locks, it's actually maintaining it, right? So how that would be maintained remains a big unknown. But there are big ideas out there for how to get grain out. And I keep going on about how hard that is, actually, but I realize.
One last question. Oh, okay. Okay. Why don't we cut it off there so we can get to the next class and so forth. Thanks, Peter.